Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Afika, and I will be your MC for today. We would like to offer our sincere gratitude to everyone present here for taking time out of your day to attend this session. Okay, and without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Andy Snowball on stage for his presentation on the topic. Uh, uh, I'm so sorry. Rise of ransomware. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Afika. Thanks everyone for joining, and welcome to my presentation, which is 2020, The Rise of Ransomware. My name's Andy Snowball. I'm the head of incident response for BA Systems. Today's presentation is going to be split up into three parts. So first of all, we're going to look at some trends that happened over the course of 2020 and into this year with ransomware attacks. Then we're going to focus on some incident response cases that we responded to for our customers. And then finally, we're going to look at some recommendations that organizations can look at to try and prevent these types of attacks from happening. So I think you'll all agree that it's very difficult to avoid seeing about ransomware attacks now. They're just in the press all the time, not just security press, but in sort of the public domain press as well. So these are some of the headlines that we saw sort of popping up in the general press from 2020. So just focusing on a few of these from this year, actually. So the top left, this one was quite a large ransomware incident in the US that hit an organization called JBS that's responsible for processing meat, caused massive problems to the supply chain in the US for meat. Second one down is the Colonial Pipeline attack. This one shut down this huge pipeline that's responsible for moving huge volumes of oil products around the US, caused all sorts of disruption there as well. And then a bit closer to home for us in the UK, at least, is the Irish healthcare attack. This one has really impacted the healthcare system over there. The attackers actually released the keys to the Irish healthcare, but they were still unable to recover the data immediately. It took them a long time to get all the data back from backups and restore everything, bring everything back up. In terms of what we're seeing targeting Malaysia in particular, we've seen sort of relatively recently in May this year that the Asian division of AXA Insurance got hit by a ransomware attack. This affected Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Hong Kong. Fortunately, the group behind this, the Avedon ransomware group, has actually shut down now. So the data that they stole as part of this attack is unlikely to sort of get anywhere else now. So that's just some of the examples of ransomware attacks that we saw during the course of 2020 and into this year as well. So how do these attacks actually happen? So the first stage is the attacker needs to get onto the network in some way. And there's a few methods that they tend to use to do this. So the first method is by a phishing email. And this is common across lots of different types of attacks, not just ransomware attacks, but it's also used in ransomware attacks as well. What tends to happen with the phishing emails is that the attacker will send in some kind of malicious payload as an attachment. So it's normally some kind of Office document, like an Excel file or a Word document, that includes a macro within that document, and that macro will drop some remote access Trojan onto that user's machine. Another method that attackers are using quite a lot now as well are sort of exploiting vulnerabilities that organizations might have. So we've seen a set of vulnerabilities exploited mainly in this year, actually. So we've seen vulnerabilities in the Pulse Secure VPN product that's been exploited by attackers for deploying ransomware. And also the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, which was exploited by the Hafnium group. Those ransomware groups also leveraging that vulnerability later on. So they're quite the sort of two most common methods of these attacks happening. The third method is RDP. So RDP is a method of accessing your computer remotely over the internet. As soon as you open up RDP on your firewall, attackers are going to be scanning that and trying to identify new servers with RDP open, and they'll try and brute force the accounts to get into those machines. And then the final method that we've seen used is third-party or via managed service provider. So if an organization's outsourced their IT to a third-party company, if an attacker can get into that third-party company, they then have a lot more targets than just that one organization and can target that organization's customers as well. So that's a really effective way for ransomware attackers to get into lots of organizations at the same time. The second phase of the attack, once they're on the network, is they're going to try and sort of move around the network, find out where all of the organization's sensitive data is, and they're going to try and steal that data. So they'll take copies of the data, and they're going to use that stolen data later on in the attack. Once they've done that, they've identified all the core systems, they'll start to encrypt data. This will include backups as well. So if organizations are using disk-based backup and they don't have any offline tapes, then the attackers will attempt to wipe all of those backups as well. Make it really difficult for the organizations to recover from the data. The third stage is they'll demand a ransom. So this can happen in a few different ways. You've probably seen sort of these locker screens that pop up on people's machines once they've been encrypted. That's one method. Another method that we've seen is just the attacker dropping text files onto the machines. So if you go into your documents folder and you try and open documents, you'll find all the files are encrypted, apart from one text file, which has got the instructions on how to pay the ransom fee. Then the attackers have a sort of number of methods of increasing the stakes here to make victim organizations pay up. So if there's no payment at this stage, then the attackers will start to publish some sample data. So that data that they stole in stage 2 of the attack, they'll start to publish some of that on their dark web blog site. So we'll look at one of those examples of some of those sites in a second. Then they'll start making public threats. So they might contact the press and say, "Oh, we've attacked this organization and we've stolen all of their data." We've even seen people in organizations being phoned by the attackers. So the attackers will phone them up and say, "Look, we've ransomware you. You should really pay up to get your data back." And then the final step that we've seen is auction. So this isn't too common. There's only a few groups doing this. But if the victim organization hasn't paid the ransom fee, the attackers will then try and auction the data off to whoever wants to pay the most. And they're just really trying to monetize that stolen data that they've got their hands on. These are some examples of blog sites that the attackers have set up. So these are all on the Tor network, so you can't get to these in a normal browser. You need the Tor browser to access these sites. But they are relatively open in terms of getting to them. And they're not sort of particularly complicated websites. They're not going to win any awards for best website of the year, but they are quite effective in terms of what they're doing. So if we look at this Klopp blog as an example, they've got all of the victims listed here, and you can sort of go and click on one of these victims and it'll take you to a page showing all the details of that victim, what the company size is, how much revenue they make, and then links to all of the stolen data. And then towards the bottom of the site down here, you can see this is kind of a live stream of updates that the attackers are making to the blog. And you can see them sort of publishing various parts of the data that they've stolen. So they're not just ransomware in the network, but they're also stealing all this data, making it public, and really sort of embarrassing the victim organizations to make them pay. In terms of what we've seen over the last year and a half, this is a chart showing the number of attacks per day. So at a peak, sort of November time last year, we're seeing just upwards of 8 victims per day. So this is 8 sort of large organizations being hit by ransomware every day. And these are just the ones that are appearing on the attackers' blogs that we're tracking. There's a few sort of spikes of activity and a few dips. So the attackers towards the end of the year, the end of 2020, they said they were going to take some time off and have a bit of a rest over the Christmas and New Year period. And that seems to be what they did, because there was a bit of a drop of activity there. But then over the course of this year, it's slowly gone back up again. And it's still sort of trending upwards in terms of the number of attacks per day. So where the attackers targeting? So this is a heat map that shows the countries that they've targeted. The US is by far the highest country, so there's about 55% of the ransomware attacks are hitting the US. This is likely to be because the cyber insurance policies over there are a bit more established, and organizations are more likely to pay up. So the attackers are going to go after organizations where they're going to get money. So if they target organizations which have got cyber insurance and their cyber insurance is going to pay, then they'll go after those organizations. We've seen targeting sort of spread around the world. There's a few groups that sort of focus primarily on Europe, and they don't target any victims in the US at all. And I mentioned before, we've seen some activity in Asia as well, sort of moving further east. We haven't seen a huge spike of cases in Malaysia yet, which is good news for you guys. But what we're suspecting will happen is that the US are trying to restrict these ransomware payments. So if that happens and the attackers can't get ransomware payments out of the US, they'll just move elsewhere. So they'll focus their efforts more on Europe and the Asia Pacific areas. So that's a bit of a sort of background of what happened over the last year and a half in terms of ransomware. Now we're going to look at 3 example cases that our incident response team worked on for our customers. So the first case, this was an organization which had quite a large number of servers on premise. So had almost 2,000 servers on premise. Those servers were all destroyed. They're all virtual machines. They all got destroyed completely by the ransomware. And the organization's backups were all disk-based. They had 190 terabytes of backups that were wiped by the attackers. Almost all the business applications were hosted on these on-premise servers. The organization did have some cloud-based services, but most of the business applications were on the on-prem infrastructure. So they were all impacted by this attack. Cloud-based services such as G Suite and AWS were unaffected, so those services remained up and running. And the end user devices, the organization was using Chromebooks here, which is quite unusual, and those devices also weren't affected by the attack. The attack appeared in the national press in the UK. So this was on the BBC News website on a few occasions. So it was really sort of high profile, and this puts a lot of pressure on the organization to get things back up and running as quickly as possible. We were on site the day after the attack. These were a new customer for us that came in as an emergency. So we didn't have any existing relationship with them, and we helped them with all of the recovery and investigation work. The second case, slightly different infrastructures. There's a mix of on-premise and Azure-hosted infrastructures, about 700 servers in total destroyed. Multiple business applications impacted, including some safety-critical systems. Similar sort of thing with the cloud environment. Their Office 365 environment was unaffected by the attack. So they'd moved all of their email into Office 365 and some of their SharePoint services into Office 365 as well. This was quite a large organization, so we had about 10,500 employees working remotely. And this caused some difficulties with sort of getting new laptops out to them and getting machines rebuilt. This one wasn't in the press quite as much. This was in some security news and some sector-specific news sites, but this was still putting quite a lot of pressure on the organization to sort of get the situation resolved. And we were on site about 2 days after the attack. So again, this wasn't an existing customer of ours that came into us specifically for this emergency work. And in the final case, this was a much smaller incident. This only impacted a development network in one of our customers' environments. It was quite a large development network, so it had about 120 machines in it. There wasn't really any business impact other than the fact that there was a large team of developers that weren't able to work anymore. There wasn't any details of this attack in the press, and the attacker didn't seem to steal any data either. But there was considerable concern from the organization that they might have been able to move into the main corporate network from the access that they had. So we spent a lot of time investigating and making sure that there's no way that the attacker could have moved into that corporate environment. So how did the attackers get in each case? So in case number 1, so this was the large on-premise infrastructure. They had a vulnerable external service. So during the COVID pandemic, one of the firewall engineers had decided he was going to work from home, and he thought it would be a good idea to open up RDP to his corporate desktop in the office. As soon as he did that, it was literally sort of 20 minutes later, we saw scanning activity happening. Then we saw a huge volume of failed authentication attempts. So that it was around 70,000 failed authentication attempts in a 2-hour period. So these attackers were just absolutely hammering this machine with all sorts of credentials, trying to get into this machine. And then we started to see successful authentication attempts. And this was an indicator that the attacker had got onto that machine, that single machine that had been exposed. And that was how they initially got onto the network. Case number 2 was a phishing email. So this one was quite interesting because the email didn't come into the user's corporate account. It came into his Hotmail, his personal Hotmail account. And he just happened to be checking his email one lunchtime. So you could see him at 12:30 opening up his Hotmail, opening this phishing email up, and then there was an attachment within the email which he opened up. It was an Excel file. He then enabled macros in the Excel file, and this allowed a small remote access tool to be dropped onto his machine, and that gave the attackers the initial access onto the network. And in case number 3, so this was the development network. This one was quite interesting. So this was where a system administrator was tricked into downloading some malware that was pretending to be some drivers for a tape library. So you went onto Google, tried to search for these tape library drivers, ended up on a malicious site, downloaded the drivers, and that again installed a remote access tool on this system administrator's machine. So that's how the attackers got onto the network in each case. So what did they do next after they got onto the network? So the next stage is they want to escalate the privileges. They want to get domain admin access, essentially. So in the first case, they exploited a vulnerability in Windows, in the Windows Background Intelligent Transfer Service. So this vulnerability was patched by Microsoft in March 2020. This incident happened in October 2020. So there's quite a big gap there between the patch being released and the attacker leveraging that vulnerability. So there's an opportunity there for the organization to apply patches, and they missed this, unfortunately. This vulnerability allowed a user with normal user access to a machine to elevate to system access. So then essentially they've got full control over that machine at that point. And then they can dump further credentials using other tools like Mimikatz or Lasagna. And then they can use those additional credentials to move around the network. Case number 2, so this was the user who'd been checking his Hotmail. What happened here was that the attacker brute forced a domain admin account. So they managed to, from the point at which they got onto the network to brute forcing this domain admin account successfully, was about 30 minutes. The domain admin account hadn't had its password changed since 2005, and it was a very simple password. And the organization hadn't wanted to change this password because they didn't know what the account was used for, and they didn't want to break anything. So keeping a really good eye on your privileged accounts is a good recommendation here. And then in case number 3, so this was the tape library drivers that the attacker had sort of fooled the system administrator into downloading. So the system administrator had actually downloaded these straight onto the backup server, and he was logged onto the backup server with a domain admin account. So when the attacker got access to this machine, they were already a domain administrator, so they didn't need to do any privilege escalation at this point. So now the attackers are on the network. They've all got sort of domain admin level access to the networks. So what did they do next? So next, they want to move around the network. They want to try and find all of that sensitive data. They want to identify where the backup servers are on the network, and they want to try and disrupt those servers as much as possible. So they tend to use 2 tools for this. There are other tools that they use as well, but these 2 are the most common. So RDP is the first tool. Most organizations still use RDP internally for system administration purposes. It's nice and easy to use. It gives you a good user interface. So system administrators tend to like it. But attackers also like it as well because it's enabled on a lot of organizations' networks, and there's not too many security controls in place around it. So if an attacker can use this to connect to servers, for example, then they'll use that tool to do that. PSExec is another tool that we tend to see used a lot. So this is used by attackers to move around. We've also seen it being used to actually deploy the ransomware payload itself. So attackers like this because, again, a lot of organizations use this legitimately. So it's already installed on the machines. If it's not installed, the attacker can download it quite easily. The executable file for PSExec is produced by Microsoft, and it's a signed Microsoft binary file. So it's not going to get detected by any antivirus software or anything like that. So attackers tend to like to use this because it sort of blends into the background a bit. So in terms of the post-incident impact, so the first case, this was the company with a large number of on-premise servers that were all encrypted. When we got on site originally, there wasn't really anything left. There was no servers up and running. There was 2 physical domain controllers that were still working, but all of the virtual machines that were on-premise had gone. We were able to recover some data due to a feature or a flaw in the ransomware, where it didn't encrypt the entire file. So we were able to get about 60 terabytes of data back for the customer. We wrote some recovery tools for them and used those tools to recover data as automatically as possible. The customer accelerated their migration to cloud-based services, so they had much better security controls in place around their cloud environments. So they wanted to move all of the business applications into the cloud environment where it's more secure. In terms of the recovery, this is still ongoing to bring back some of the applications. So bear in mind that this attack happened in October last year, and we're now sort of almost in July the following year, and they're still bringing back business applications. There was some sensitive data stolen by the attackers as well and published on the dark web. So this was sort of quite embarrassing for the victim organization. But it wasn't a massive amount of data, as we'll see in the next case, where there was a huge volume of data taken. So case number 2, the core infrastructure services and most of the business applications were back up in about 2 months. The organization didn't lose very much data because they were using offline tape backups for storage. So we were able to recover from those tape backups quite easily. They did, unfortunately, have a very large volume of data stolen by the attackers and published on the dark web. So when the attackers first started doing this, the first incident that we became aware of where this happened was the Travelex incident, which happened in sort of towards the end of 2019. The attackers stole about 2 to 5 gigabytes of data, so quite a lot, but not a massive amount. In this instant, the attackers took 1.5 terabytes of data. So you can see that they've shifted technique a bit and they're really sort of focusing on stealing as much data as possible to try and get the victim organizations to pay the ransom fee. And in the final case, this was the development network. So this environment was sort of brought back up from tape backup in about 2 weeks. They did have some problems restoring from the tapes initially, but were able to eventually. And there wasn't any significant data lost because the customer was able to restore from quite a recent tape backup. And there was no evidence that we found of the attacker trying to steal any data from the network. So we didn't see any being exposed by the attacker on their blog. So that's the 3 sort of example cases that that we responded to last year. So the important thing now is to look at some recommendations to stop this from happening to your organization. So we've put together this list of recommendations that just hopefully will make it harder for attackers to conduct ransomware attacks on your network, and also to make it easier to respond if something like this does happen. So the first recommendation is around backups. So making sure that your backups are secure. So if you're using tape backup, this is great. A lot of organizations have moved away from tape and they're using disk-based or they're using some kind of cloud service for doing backups. The key thing here is to make sure that the attacker can't get onto that backup data and wipe it in any way or tamper with it. So if you've got on-premise infrastructure for backups, then segmenting the backup servers, making it impossible for the attacker to move onto those servers is a really important step here. Protecting the perimeter of the network. So we've seen sort of services exposed to the internet that attackers can leverage, but we're not just talking about exposed services. We're also talking about what data can pass over the perimeter of the network. So what email filtering have you got in place? What web filtering have you got for users who are browsing the internet? Is that going to detect and stop a ransomware attack from happening? Patch IT infrastructure. So this is particularly around external services such as VPNs and proxies and firewalls, that kind of stuff. Most organizations have got quite a good handle on patching the Windows infrastructure, so the end user machines and the servers, but not so much on the actual sort of appliances almost. Decommission end-of-life hardware and software. This is really important because the vendor isn't going to be producing security patches for these end-of-life products anymore. So if you've got something end-of-life that isn't being patched and there's a vulnerability, then that's an easy point in for an attacker. Or if they're on the network, it's an easy way for them to move around internally. It can also be quite difficult to actually monitor some legacy stuff, depending on what tooling you can install on it. Fifth recommendation, ensure common methods that you use to spread ransomware are reduced. So these attacks are all human-operated ransomware attacks. So it's someone sitting at a keyboard. The attacker's actually sitting there physically interacting with your network. So thinking about methods that you can use to stop them from moving around the network. So network segmentation, using the host-based firewalls on machines to lock down access more. Are good ways to prevent the attacker from moving around the network once they've got into it. Implement detections for pen testing tools such as Cobalt Strike. So in every incident that we've responded to in the last year and a half, we've seen Cobalt Strike used in some way. So Cobalt Strike is a legitimate pen testing tool, but attackers have started to use it quite a lot for their attacks because it doesn't get detected by antivirus. So detecting that is really important. Implement application allow listing. This is quite tricky to implement, but if you can get this done and sort of deployed successfully, this is really going to help with preventing the attackers from installing additional tools such as Cobalt Strike or Mimikatz onto the machines on the network and making it more difficult for them to conduct the attack. Enable Credential Guard in Windows 10. So Credential Guard is a good feature in Windows 10 that will prevent attackers from being able to steal credentials from machines, and also preventing users from having local admin access is a good recommendation as well. It makes it much harder for an attacker to run tools if they're running them as a normal user rather than as an administrator. Control highly privileged accounts. So in each of the attacks, again, we've seen that the attackers used a domain admin account that hasn't had its password reset for a long time. So having a good control over those domain admin and enterprise admin accounts is really important. And then the final two recommendations, ensure that your incident response playbooks and documentation are up to date, and also that you're conducting regular tabletop exercises to test those processes out and really make sure that you're ready to respond to an attack if it happens, and you're able to detect it as well, most importantly. So that's it from me. Does anyone have any questions? I don't see any in the chat yet. All right, I don't think we've got any questions, but thank you very much for everyone who joined the presentation. And if you do have any questions that you haven't been able to put into the chat, my email address is on screen, so please feel free to email any questions through that you might think of. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Andy, for your speech.